The sun was sinking low over the Arizona desert, painting the canyon walls in strokes of copper and fire. Dust hung in the air, mingled with the faint scent of smoke from the bandit raid that had destroyed everything Evelyn Hart knew. Her family's wagon, once filled with laughter, hymns, and the sound of her mother's lullabies, was a smoldering ruin. She had fled blindly, clutching her torn skirts and a silver locket that held her mother's picture. Her feet bled from running over sharp rock, her throat raw from crying out for help that never came. By the time the stars appeared, she was lost, utterly and terribly alone. The silence of the canyon was heavier than darkness, broken only by the rustle of wind through dry brush. Every shadow felt alive, every sound like a whisper from something unseen. Evelyn pressed her back to a rock wall and drew her knees close, shivering despite the heat still rising from the desert floor. She had been told since childhood that Apaches haunted these lands, merciless warriors who took scalps and vanished like spirits. Tonight she prayed those were only stories, but fate had already heard her prayer too late. A faint crunch of gravel echoed somewhere behind her. Evelyn froze. Her breath caught in her throat as a figure stepped from the darkness, tall, broad-shouldered, and silent as the night itself. His skin gleamed like burnished bronze in the moonlight, his hair long and tied with leather. Across his chest was a bandolier of arrows, and in his hand a bow carved from dark wood. The Apache warrior moved closer, his steps soundless, his eyes unreadable as they found hers. Evelyn tried to run, but her legs gave way beneath her. She stumbled back against the rocks, a cry escaping her lips. He didn't speak at first, only looked at her with the stillness of a predator who didn't yet know whether to strike. Then, in English broken but deep, he said, "You are far from your people, white girl." His voice wasn't cruel. It was calm, low, almost curious. That frightened her more. "Please," she whispered. "I don't mean harm. I'm lost." He lowered his bow but did not step closer. "Lost," he repeated, the word strange on his tongue. Then after a pause he added, "Or taken by the land." Evelyn didn't understand. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. "My family, they're gone. Bandits. They—" Her voice cracked. He studied her in silence. Then, in one smooth motion, he slung his bow across his back and reached down to lift her by the arm. His grip was strong, calloused, but not cruel. She tried to pull away, but his strength was impenetrable. "You come," he said simply. "This place, bad for small ones." "I'm not small," she protested weakly, but her words faltered as her knees buckled again. He caught her before she fell. He didn't carry her like a captive. He carried her like someone carrying weight he didn't want but couldn't abandon. The path he took wound through jagged stone and narrow passes that shimmered under moonlight. Evelyn didn't recognize any of it. The world she knew, green fields, fences, hymns, was gone. The air here belonged to the earth and sky alone. At last they reached a hidden valley tucked between red cliffs. A campfire flickered there, surrounded by shadowy figures who turned at once when they saw her. A dozen Apache men and women stood, eyes hard with suspicion. Children peeked from behind their mothers, pointing and whispering. One older woman, her face lined with wisdom and sorrow, stepped forward and spoke sharply to the warrior in their language. Evelyn didn't understand a word, but she heard her own name, white woman, in the tone of disapproval. The warrior answered in the same tongue, calm but firm. The others murmured, uncertain. Finally, he looked back at Evelyn. "You stay," he said. "You safe. For now, for now," she repeated, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked away into the dark, the firelight carving gold lines down his shoulders. Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, realizing her life was no longer her own. She didn't know his name yet, or that his mercy would soon shatter both their worlds. But as the canyon wind whispered through the camp, something deep inside her whispered, too. Nothing would ever be the same again. The first night in the Apache camp was a blur of fear and sleeplessness for Evelyn Hart. The air smelled of smoke and sage, of animals and earth. She sat close to the fire they'd given her, her wrists still trembling from the feel of the warrior's grip. Around her, figures moved like shadows, some watching, some whispering, most ignoring her completely. The older woman who had scolded the warrior earlier gave Evelyn a small clay bowl of stew. It smelled rich with herbs and game, but she couldn't bring herself to eat. Across the camp, the warrior, Taza, she had heard one of them call him, sat sharpening a blade under the moonlight. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone who had spent his whole life in silence and motion. He didn't look at her once, and yet she felt his presence constantly, like a fire burning at her back. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter. The canyon was colder than she had expected, and the stars seemed close enough to touch, though their beauty gave her no comfort. She thought of her mother's hymns, her father's Bible, and wondered if God could even see her here. When dawn broke, Taza appeared beside her fire with a small cup of water. "Drink," he said simply. His English was clipped but clear. She hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed somewhere past her shoulder at the horizon. Finally, he said, "Because I found you. I am responsible. Responsible." The word struck her as strange, so formal, so heavy. Not a word she expected from a man she'd been taught to fear. The days passed slowly. Taza brought her food, checked her bindings when her ankles swelled from walking, but he never lingered. He spoke little to her, and the tribe even less. Most of the Apache women ignored her, though one or two glanced at her with pity. Evelyn began to understand she was not a guest. She was an obligation, a question no one wanted to answer. Still, Taza treated her differently. Once she saw him with the children, mending a bowstring for a small boy, patient and quiet as the boy fumbled with the knot. The sight startled her. She had imagined warriors as cruel men, but there was something in Taza's calmness that unsettled her more than cruelty could have. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered a few steps from the camp to the edge of the canyon. The stars shimmered above her like spilled glass. She didn't hear him approach until he was beside her. "You should not walk alone," he said quietly. She turned. "You're always watching me." "Yes." His honesty was disarming. "Why? You think I'll run?" He studied her for a long moment. "You are afraid. People who are afraid do foolish things." His words stung, though he hadn't meant them cruelly. She wrapped her arms around herself. "I'm not foolish," she said, her voice low. "Just lost." Taza nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Lost is not the same as weak," he said. Something in his tone, something protective, almost gentle, made her chest tighten. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, not even her father. When she returned to the fire, she lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep. Across the camp, she saw Taza sitting alone again, his face lit by the dim glow of dying embers. He was whittling something small, a shape she couldn't see. His features softened in the flickering light, and for the first time, she wondered who he was before the war, before all the hate that separated their worlds. As the nights went on, she began to understand the rhythm of their life, the way they rose before dawn, the way laughter sometimes broke through their guarded quiet, the way Taza always checked the horizon before eating. There was order in it and even beauty. And though he never touched her, Evelyn began to feel something in his silence, a promise she couldn't name, and a danger she couldn't resist. The others began to notice too. Every time her gaze lingered too long on Taza, the camp grew a little colder. The women turned away faster. The men watched her with narrowed eyes. Whispers followed her when she fetched water or gathered wood. And in those silent nights, when the fire's last light danced over Taza's profile, Evelyn Hart, once the virgin girl from a quiet church town, began to understand the truth of her own whispered prayer. It wasn't death she feared anymore. It was the man who had saved her. The morning sun crept over the canyon rim, washing the Apache camp in golden shadow. Evelyn had learned to wake before the others, if only to steal a few quiet moments with the dawn. But that day a sharp cry shattered the silence. She turned to see one of the young men struggling to hold up a horse that had collapsed near the corral. The animal's side was slick with blood, its breath coming in ragged bursts. Taza was already there, kneeling beside the creature. His face was grim, his hands steady as he pressed against the wound. Blood poured through his fingers. "Arrow," he muttered, examining the shaft lodged deep in the horse's flank. "Bandits," another warrior spat. "They ride close," Evelyn's heart raced. The horse was terrified, its eyes rolling white with pain. She knew that look. She'd seen it on her father's cattle after a cougar attack. Without thinking, she ran forward. "Let me help," she said, breathless. Every head turned. The older woman, Taza's mother, barked something sharp in their language. Evelyn caught only one word. No, Taza didn't look up. You cannot help, he said, his tone even but firm. Yes, I can, she insisted. I've treated worse. My father, he was a rancher. Please. Their gazes locked, and for a heartbeat the camp seemed to still. Then Taza gave a short nod. Do it. She tore the hem of her dress and pressed it against the wound, motioning for hot water. The older women hesitated, then obeyed Taza's order. Evelyn cleaned the blood, whispering softly to the animal until its trembling slowed. The arrow was deep, but she had learned to be calm in the face of suffering. Hold him steady, she said, her hands shaking despite herself. Taza braced the horse's neck while she gripped the arrow and pulled. The animal screamed. Blood sprayed across her arms. She nearly fell, but Taza's hand steadied her. Together they worked in silence until the bleeding stopped and the wound was wrapped tight. When it was done, Evelyn sat back, shaking, her dress torn and stained. The camp was silent. Then slowly one of the women nodded in approval. A few murmured words of respect in Apache passed around the circle. Taza stood, watching Evelyn wipe her hands on the dirt. His expression was unreadable, but there was something new in his eyes, something softer, almost reverent. You did well, he said quietly. She looked up at him, chest heaving. So did you, she whispered. He tilted his head slightly. You are not as fragile as you look. That night the camp celebrated, not for her, but for the horse that had lived. Fires burned bright. Drums echoed through the canyon, and the people danced under the stars. Evelyn sat apart, her hands raw, her heart restless. She didn't see Taza approach until he sat beside her. The firelight painted his face in gold and shadow. You are quiet, he said. I don't belong here, she murmured. They look at me like I'm a ghost. He nodded slowly. They do not know what to call you. You are not enemy, not kin. Between. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. Between, she echoed. That's a lonely place to be. He watched her for a long time. Then, in a voice so low she almost missed it, he asked, Do you wish to go back? Her throat tightened. Back to what? She asked. To a world that's already gone? Silence fell between them, deep as the desert night. The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the sky. Evelyn turned toward him, her voice trembling. Is it going to be slow? She whispered. Or is it going to hurt? He looked at her then, really looked. His eyes held something vast and unreadable, like the desert itself. What do you mean? He asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She swallowed hard. Trusting you. For a long time he said nothing. Then finally he leaned closer, his words barely more than breath. It will be slow, he said, and it will hurt. But you will not be the same. She shivered, though the night was warm. The drums faded into the distance, and all she could hear was his voice, low, certain, and dangerous. From that moment on, something began to shift between them. The line that had once separated captive and captor blurred, replaced by something neither could name. And though Evelyn didn't yet understand it, that single whisper beneath the stars was the beginning of everything, the beginning of her surrender, and of his undoing. Morning sunlight spilled down the canyon walls, turning the stones to gold. Evelyn woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of footsteps. Taza stood over her, already dressed for travel, bow in hand, a small bundle tied to his back. Come, he said. You learned today. Learn what? She asked, blinking the sleep from her eyes. He only tilted his head toward the cliffs. The land, he replied. The others watched as he led her away from the camp. She could feel their stares. Some curious, others sharp as knives, but Taza ignored them all. The two of them walked in silence through narrow paths and dry riverbeds. The morning air was cool, the sky washed clean after last night's wind. After a while, Taza stopped and crouched beside a patch of sand. He brushed his fingers across the ground, then pointed. Tracks, he said. Evelyn leaned closer. I don't see anything. He gave a faint smile. That is the first thing you must learn, to see what is already there. He took her hand and guided her fingers along the faint marks in the earth. Deer, 2, maybe 3, passed here before the sun. She felt the warmth of his hand, rough and steady against hers. How can you tell? Because the sand still remembers, he said simply. For the rest of the morning, Taza taught her how to listen, to the wind, to the calls of birds, to the whispers of the earth beneath her feet. He moved like part of the landscape itself, silent and patient. Evelyn followed, tripping more than once, earning a quiet chuckle from him that made her cheeks burn. When they reached the river, she gasped. It cut through the desert like a ribbon of life sparkling in the sun. She hadn't seen running water since the raid. Taza knelt at the edge and filled his hands, drinking deeply. "You may bathe," he said, glancing toward the rocks that offered some privacy. "I will wait." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded. She knelt by the water, cupping handfuls over her face. The coolness bit her skin, washing away the dust and fear that had clung to her for days. For the first time since her capture, she felt almost human again. When she looked up, she saw her reflection rippling beside his, two worlds mirrored in one current. Later, Taza joined her at the bank. He began teaching her words in Apache, slow and careful. "Water," he said, pointing. "Two," she repeated it, her accent clumsy but eager. He nodded approvingly. "Good. And this?" she asked, touching the sky. He followed her gaze. "Zil," he said. "Sky or heaven?" "Both same," Evelyn smiled. "In my world, they're not the same." He tilted his head, studying her. "In mine, they are never apart." Their eyes met, and something in the air shifted, soft, fragile, but alive. She looked away first, dipping her fingers into the current to hide her flush. The lesson continued until the sun hung high overhead. He showed her how to move quietly through the reeds, how to tell where a snake had passed, how to feel the rhythm of the land instead of fighting it. Every gesture, every word carried a strange tenderness, as if he were showing her sacred secrets. When she slipped on a wet stone and gasped, Taza's hand shot out instantly, catching her around the waist. She clutched his arm, her heart pounding. I'm fine," she stammered, though her voice trembled. His hand lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, Evelyn saw something raw behind his stoicism, something like hunger or pain. He let go, stepping back as though burned. "Be careful," he said quietly. She nodded, though her breath still caught in her chest. The world around them felt different now, charged with something she couldn't name. As they walked back to camp, she dared to glance at him once more. His face was calm again, unreadable. But she knew he'd felt it too, the pull neither could escape. That night she lay awake by the fire, tracing the sound of the river in her memory. Taza sat alone as always, his face turned toward the stars. She watched him in silence, wondering if he knew that the lesson had gone deeper than tracking or survival. He had taught her how to see the land, but more dangerously, he had taught her how to see him. By the time the moon grew full, Evelyn had spent nearly a month among the Apache. The fear that had once ruled her every breath had softened into something else, something she didn't understand. She still didn't belong, not truly, but she had learned their rhythms, the songs that rose with the dusk, the smell of mesquite smoke in the air, the laughter of children who no longer hid when she passed. It was on such a night that the camp began to prepare for the Night of the Spirits, a ceremony Taza's mother explained through gestures and broken words. Ancestors, sky, thanks, renewal. The fire pit was widened, the drums brought out, the air heavy with the scent of burning sage and cedar. Everyone painted their faces with lines of white and red, symbols of journeys and memories. Evelyn watched from a distance, feeling more like a shadow than ever. She had no paint, no symbols, no ancestors in this canyon to honor. Her people's prayers were sung in churches, not to the sky. She felt her throat tighten as she watched the women braid each other's hair, their laughter bright beneath the darkening sky. Taza approached her quietly, carrying a bowl of red pigment. His chest was bare, the markings across his skin sharp and proud. The firelight glowed against him, catching the glint of his copper armbands. He stopped in front of her, gaze steady. "You should join," he said simply. She shook her head. "I can't, it isn't my place." He studied her, then knelt before her. "Tonight," he said softly, "is for all souls, even lost ones." Before she could protest, he dipped 2 fingers into the paint and touched her cheek. The warmth of his hand lingered as he drew a single line from the corner of her eye down to her jaw. "Now," he murmured, "you are seen." Her breath caught. "What does it mean?" He hesitated, his eyes dark and unreadable. "It means," he said at last, "I claim what I protect." The air between them trembled. She wanted to move, to speak, but her body refused. Around them, the drumming began. Slow at first, then faster, like the beat of 100 hearts. Taza stood and held out his hand. "Come," he said. Evelyn took it before she could think. He led her into the circle where flames leapt high and sparks spun toward the heavens. The tribe began to move with the rhythm, their feet striking the earth, their voices rising in song. Evelyn felt the ground vibrate beneath her, the pulse of life itself. At first she only stood and watched. Then slowly Taza began to move beside her, guiding her with subtle gestures. Step, turn, breathe. His hand hovered near her waist, not touching but close enough to burn. The firelight painted their faces in gold and shadow, and for one dizzying moment, it felt as though the world around them had vanished. When the drums reached their peak, thunder rumbled over the canyon, echoing through the stones. The people lifted their hands to the sky, their songs louder, wilder. Evelyn followed without thinking, raising her arms, feeling something inside her break open. Grief, fear, longing, all of it poured into the night. Rain began to fall, sudden and fierce. The fire hissed but did not die. The people cheered, shouting to the heavens. Evelyn laughed, the sound strange and free on her tongue. And then she saw him, Taza, standing before her, rain streaming down his face. He looked like something carved from the earth itself, powerful, eternal. She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have marked me." His eyes locked onto hers. "I did what my heart already had," he said. Lightning split the sky, and in that flash of light she saw what she had been denying. The bond between them was no longer one of survival. It was something deeper, older, more dangerous. When the rain stopped, she found herself alone under the dripping pines, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still feel the heat of his fingers on her cheek, the weight of his words. And though the tribe sang long into the night, Evelyn could no longer hear the drums. All she heard was Taza's voice in her memory. "I claim what I protect." And she knew with a terrible certainty that neither of them would escape the fire they had started. The dawn after the night of the spirits was quiet, too quiet. The canyon usually woke with the hum of life, voices, the crackle of fires, the laughter of children, but this morning, a tension hung in the air like storm clouds refusing to break. Evelyn felt it before she understood it. The women moved briskly through camp, their eyes avoiding hers. The men spoke in low tones. Even Taza, who always carried calm like armor, moved with the taut focus of a hunter sensing danger. When she approached him, he was standing at the canyon's edge, scanning the distant horizon. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Tracks," he said. "White soldiers, close." Her heart dropped. "They're looking for me." He didn't answer, but the flicker in his eyes was enough. He'd known it before she had said it. Within the hour, the camp was in motion. People packing what they could, children being lifted onto horses. Evelyn tried to help, gathering blankets and food, but everywhere she turned, she felt the sting of suspicion. The older woman, Taza's mother, glared at her, muttering sharp words Evelyn didn't understand. Then one of the warriors shouted from a ridge, and chaos broke loose. Gunfire echoed through the canyon. Men shouted orders in both English and Apache. Evelyn dropped to the ground as bullets whined past, kicking up dirt. She saw Taza sprint toward her, bow in hand, shouting something over the roar of gunfire. "Stay down!" The soldiers had found them. Smoke filled the air as the Apache fought back fiercely, their war cries piercing through the thunder of rifles. Evelyn pressed herself behind a rock, trembling. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go, only cliffs and gunfire. Then she saw him, Taza, racing up the ridge, loosing arrows with deadly precision. He was a blur of movement and fire, his face streaked with paint and sweat. But there were too many soldiers. She could see them fanning out, surrounding the camp. A bullet struck the ground near her feet, splintering stone. Evelyn screamed and ducked lower. Someone grabbed her arm roughly, hauling her upright. She turned and froze, a soldier. A white man in a dusty blue uniform. "Got you," he shouted. "The Hart girl alive." Evelyn's stomach twisted. "Wait, no," she cried, fighting against his grip. "Stop, don't shoot." He didn't listen. Two more soldiers appeared, dragging her away from the battle. She twisted, desperate to find Taza, but all she saw was smoke, flashes of red and gold, and the bodies of the fallen. Taza saw her being taken. For one brief second, their eyes met across the chaos. Then a gunshot cracked the air. He staggered. Evelyn screamed his name, but the soldiers were already pulling her down the path toward their horses. She fought them with every breath, every ounce of strength, but they overpowered her easily. One of them bound her wrists, another threw her onto a wagon seat. As they rode away, the battle still raged behind them. Apache cries, gunfire, and the echo of drums that had no rhythm left. Evelyn strained against the ropes, tears streaming down her face. "Let me go," she begged. "He's hurt." "He'll die." The soldier beside her sneered. "That savage? You should be thanking us. You were a prisoner. We saved you. Saved her." The words hit harder than any blow. Evelyn turned her face toward the canyon, watching as it shrank into the distance. She could still see the faint flicker of fire against the rocks. The only home she had known for weeks. The only place she'd felt alive. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the sounds of battle were gone. Only smoke rose from the cliffs like ghosts. The soldiers spoke of returning her to Fort Laramie, of her father's reward, of civilization. But Evelyn sat in silence, her wrists bound, her heart hollow. She had crossed from one world back into another, but she no longer belonged to either. In her mind, she saw Taz's face in that final moment, blood on his shoulder, his eyes fixed on hers, and she knew, with a pain deeper than fear, that she had left him to die. Yet somewhere deep inside, a fragile ember of hope refused to go out. Because even as the wagon rolled away, she could still hear the whisper of his voice from that night by the fire. "It will be slow. It will hurt. But you will not be the same," and she wasn't. She never would be again. The night was warm, but inside the canyon a chill ran through Clara's body. The air trembled with a strange quiet. It wasn't fear that gripped her. It was the feeling that something was about to be taken from her and given back in a different form. Nakai stood before the sacred fire. His chest was bare, painted with black and red ash. His eyes, dark as obsidian, reflected the flickering flames. The elders stood behind him, their chants echoing off the canyon walls like whispers from another realm. "This is not a ceremony of men," one of the old women said softly to Clara. "This is a bond before the Great Spirit. Once his mark touches your skin, no man will ever own you again. You will belong to the wind, to the fire, and to him." Clara trembled, clutching the woven blanket around her. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why did he choose me?" The old woman smiled, a slow, knowing smile that carried both sorrow and truth. "Because he saw the storm inside you, and because the Great Spirit gave you eyes that never looked away from pain." When Nakai approached, Clara could hardly breathe. The ritual drumbeat grew louder, steady, deliberate, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. He carried a small piece of glowing iron, shaped into the symbol of his clan, a hawk in flight. Clara's voice barely carried over the drums. "Is it going to be slow? Or is it going to hurt?" Nakai paused, his expression unreadable. Then, with the softest tone she had ever heard from him, he said, "It will burn for a moment, but it will make you free." Her breath caught. "Free?" "Yes," he said, his hand cupping her cheek. "Because pain tells the body where it ends, and where love begins." He pressed his forehead to hers, the sacred gesture of joining souls. "You can walk away now, Clara. No one will stop you." She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the fierce Apache warrior she'd first feared, but the man who had protected her from hunger, from shame, from the ghosts of her past. She didn't walk away. She nodded once, trembling. "Do it." The glowing iron touched the inside of her wrist. It hissed against her skin, and she gasped, not from agony, but from something deeper, something that tore open every locked door inside her heart. Tears spilled from her eyes, and when Nakai pulled the iron away, she saw the mark. Small, dark, and eternal. He wrapped her hand in soft leather and whispered something in Apache. She didn't understand the words, but she understood their weight. "What did you say?" she asked, still breathless. "I called you Sakina," he said quietly. "The bird who looks at the sun." The name sank into her soul like a blessing. Around them, the tribe's voices rose in chant, honoring her courage, honoring his choice. Firelight danced over them as Nakai knelt before her, placing her marked hand against his heart. For a long moment, they stayed like that, two hearts beating beneath the ancient sky, joined by a promise older than blood or language. When the chants ended, the canyon was still again. Nakai rose and looked at her. "You are no longer the girl they called a prisoner," he said. "You are mine, but not because I took you. Because you stayed. And though her wrist burned and her body trembled, Clara felt an overwhelming peace. For the first time, she wasn't running from her past. She wasn't hiding from the pain. She had walked into it, and it had turned into something holy. That night, as the stars drifted overhead, Nakai lay beside her, their hands intertwined. The mark throbbed softly between them, a symbol not of ownership but of awakening. Nothing was ever the same again. The dawn after the fire-marking ceremony painted the canyon gold. Smoke from the sacred fire still rose in thin, ghostly ribbons, and Clara woke to the sound of drums fading into the distance. For a moment she forgot who she was or who she had been. The ache in her wrist reminded her. The mark was still tender, but when she touched it, she didn't flinch. Nakai was sitting by the river, bare-chested and still as a carved statue. The morning light caught the lines of muscle across his back. The scars that spoke of battles fought for survival, for his people, for something greater than himself. She walked to him quietly, her feet brushing against the red dust. "Does it always feel like this afterward?" she asked softly. He turned to her, a small smile ghosting across his lips. "Like the world is new?" She nodded. "Like I've stepped into someone else's skin." Nakai's gaze softened. "No, you have just found the one that was always yours." They sat by the river, silence filling the space between them, an unspoken language of glances and breath. Clara dipped her hand into the cool water, letting it run over her wrist. The pain eased, but her heart raced for another reason now. "I used to think love was supposed to feel safe," she said, "like a soft place to land." Nakai reached out, his fingers brushing her jaw. "Love is not safety," he murmured. "It is truth, and truth cuts before it heals." Her heart fluttered painfully. "And what if I'm not strong enough for that truth?" He leaned closer, the warmth of his breath mingling with hers. "You already are." The kiss that followed was slow at first, a careful, trembling meeting of two souls who had been walking toward this moment since the beginning. Then, as though something ancient awoke inside them, it deepened, his hand tangled in her hair. Hers clutched his arm, feeling the strength beneath his skin. The world around them disappeared, no tribe, no past, no fear. Only the fire that had always existed between them. When their lips parted, Clara's breath came fast. "If they see us like this," she whispered, "they'll never forgive you." He looked at her with quiet defiance. "Then let them remember me as the man who kissed the sun." Her laugh was soft but full of tears. "You shouldn't risk everything for me." "I already did," he said simply. "The moment I chose not to give you back." He took her hand and placed it against his chest over the mark that mirrored hers. The hawk's shape burned faintly into his own skin. "Now you live here," he said, "even if the world falls apart." But their peace did not last long. Later that day, shadows appeared on the ridgeline, men from Clara's settlement. Soldiers. Their rifles glinted in the light, and their shouts echoed across the canyon. Clara's heart seized. "They came for me." Nakai rose immediately, eyes hardening into the warrior's gaze she remembered from the first night she saw him. "They will not take you," he said. "They think you stole me," she said, voice trembling. "They don't know what this is." "They will not understand," he said grimly, "because they have never loved what they were taught to fear." He handed her his knife. "If they come close, run toward the rocks. Do not wait for me." Tears stung her eyes. "I won't leave you." "You must." But Clara shook her head. "You marked me as yours, Nakai. You think I'll run now?" For the first time since the soldiers appeared, his expression broke, half pride, half anguish. "Then we fight together," he said quietly. As the soldiers' horses descended into the canyon, Clara gripped his hand, heart pounding. Around them, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of fire and iron. The mark on her wrist burned again, not from pain this time, but from destiny. Whatever happened next, she knew one truth as sure as breath. She would rather die beside Nakai than live one more day in the world that had once owned her. Gunfire cracked through the canyon like thunder. The echoes ricocheted off the stone walls, scattering birds into the red dawn sky. Clara clung to the side of the ravine, her breath shallow, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear from her chest. Nakai had pushed her behind the rocks just as the first shot rang out, his body shielding hers before vanishing into the smoke. She could see flashes of movement. Apache warriors darting between the ridges, their painted faces streaked with ash and determination. The soldiers, rigid in their uniforms, shouted orders in English she could barely understand through the chaos. And somewhere in that storm, Nakai's war cry rose, deep, fierce, unbroken. It was a sound that split the heart open, that spoke of defiance and love stronger than death. Clara gripped the knife he'd given her. Her hand trembled, but her resolve did not. She could hear footsteps approaching, the soldiers searching, calling her name. "Miss Clara." "We've come to take you home," one of them shouted. "We'll kill every savage that touched you." Her blood froze. Home. That word no longer meant what it used to. Home was no longer walls and prayers and rules that told her what to fear. Home was the warmth of Nakai's hands, the smell of smoke on his skin, the mark that burned on her wrist. She stepped from behind the rocks. "Stop!" she screamed. Her voice rang through the canyon, stopping men mid-stride. "No one touched me. I came here on my own." The soldiers stared, confusion flickering in their eyes. The one who had shouted before, a captain she vaguely recognized, lowered his rifle slightly. You don't mean that, Clara. You've been taken, brainwashed." Before he could finish, an arrow hissed past his cheek and buried itself in the dirt beside his boot. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Nakai stepped out of the smoke. His body was streaked with blood and dust, his bow still drawn. His eyes, wild and steady all at once, met Clara's. For a heartbeat, the world held still. "Go," he said to her, his voice low, urgent. "I can't fight them and keep you safe. I'm not leaving you," she shouted back. He moved closer, blocking her with his body as bullets shattered the rocks behind them. "Clara, listen to me. If you stay, you die. If you run, maybe the world will still have a piece of us left in it." But before she could answer, one of the soldiers lifted his gun, aimed directly at Nakai. Time slowed. She saw the spark of the flint, the curl of smoke, the bullets blur through the air, then she moved. The shot rang out, and instead of Nakai falling, she felt the blow hit her side. The world turned white, then red, then nothing. "Clara!" Nakai caught her before she hit the ground. Blood soaked through her dress, warm and slick. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. "I told you," she whispered weakly, a faint smile trembling on her lips. "I wouldn't run." He pressed his forehead to hers, just as he had the night of the fire marking. His voice broke as he whispered in Apache words she couldn't quite understand. But she felt their meaning. "Don't leave me. Not now." Her hand lifted, trembling, and she touched the mark on his chest, the same hawk that burned on her wrist. "We're already won," she breathed. Then her hand fell away. The soldiers had stopped firing. Some watched in silence, stunned. Others began to back away, haunted by the sight of the wounded girl clinging to the warrior they had come to kill. Nakai rose slowly, lifting Clara into his arms. The moon had begun to rise, a pale ghost against the morning sky, and under that fading light, he carried her toward the river. Blood dripped from his hands, but his face was calm now, tragic, sacred. He looked up at the soldiers one last time. "You came to save her," he said quietly, "but she was never yours to save." And as he disappeared into the shadows of the canyon, the river's song swallowed, the sound of their cries, the blood and the moonlight became one, marking the end of what had been and the beginning of what could never be undone. The days that followed became whispers carried by the desert wind. The soldiers left the canyon, shaken and ashamed, unable to face the truth of what they'd seen, of a girl who had chosen the very man they were taught to destroy. They called her lost, bewitched, dead to the world. But none of their words reached the truth, because Clara did not die. When she awoke, it was to the sound of running water and the smell of cedar smoke. Her side burned, bandaged tightly in woven herbs and soft hides. Nakai was beside her, his face hollow with exhaustion and grief. She tried to speak, but he pressed his hand to her lips. "You don't need to fight anymore," he whispered. "The Great Spirit heard my prayer." Her eyes filled with tears. I thought I was gone." "You were," he said softly, "and then you came back to me." They were hiding deep in a valley the soldiers would never find, where the cliffs rose high and the wind sang through the stones. Nakai's people tended to her with quiet reverence, as if she were part of something sacred now. The old woman who had once spoken to her by the fire came each morning to bless her wound with smoke, and murmured words Clara couldn't understand. When Clara could finally stand, she went to the riverbank where her reflection shimmered in the water. The mark on her wrist had darkened to a deep bronze. The hawk seemed to move when she flexed her hand, alive, burning, eternal. She thought of all that had happened the night she first met him, the fear that had twisted into longing, the pain that had turned to freedom. "Nothing will ever be the same," she whispered. Behind her, Nakai's voice was low and steady. "That is how you know it was real." He came to stand beside her, their reflections side by side in the water. "My people will leave this place soon," he said quietly. "The soldiers will come again. We cannot stay." Clara's chest tightened. "And me?" He turned to her, eyes soft with both love and sorrow. "If you go with me, you lose your world forever. If you stay, they will never let you live in peace." Tears filled her eyes, blurring the river and the horizon beyond it. "Then there's nowhere for me," she said brokenly. He cupped her face in his hands. "There is," he said. "Here," and he placed her hand over his heart. "You live where love is remembered." That night, under the silver light of the moon, they lay together once more. No words, no fear, only the rhythm of breath and heartbeat, two souls finally still in the same silence. When dawn came, Nakai was gone. Clara searched the canyon, but all that remained was his hawk pendant, resting beside her on the blanket. Around it were tiny white stones, arranged carefully into the shape of a bird in flight. Her mark burned again, but this time it didn't hurt. It pulsed gently like a living thing. She knew then what he had done. He had left so she could live, so his people could survive, so the story of what they had been together wouldn't die under a soldier's bullet or a preacher's sermon. Years later, when settlers spoke of the woman who once lived alone in the desert and wore an Apache mark on her wrist, they told it as a cautionary tale. They said she'd been cursed. Others whispered she'd been blessed. Some said they'd seen her at dusk standing on the ridge, looking toward the horizon, waiting for a shadow to appear against the setting sun. But those who truly listened, those who could still hear the wind's song through the canyons, told it differently. They said the girl didn't die in that battle. They said she touched fire and became part of it. They said her spirit rose each night with the hawk that flew over the desert, watching, waiting, unbound. And when the moonlight touched the river just right, you could still see her reflection beside his, the virgin girl who whispered, "Is it going to be slow or is it going to hurt?" And the Apache warrior who taught her that pain could be the beginning of love, not the end of it.